I used to think love was loud, that it had to shout, crash, and burn to be real. But with Lila, it was quiet. It was the sound of her breath against my chest when she fell asleep, the way she laughed with her eyes before her mouth, the way her fingers would find mine without looking. We were simple, unremarkable, but ours was the kind of happiness that didn't ask to be noticed. Until the night everything changed. The rain started before sunset that evening, heavy and endless, turning the streets into mirrors. We had spent the day with her mother, and we were driving home through a road that twisted through the hills. The wipers couldn't keep up. She was laughing about something I can't remember now, a small, harmless thing, and I remember thinking, I could live inside that laugh forever. Then headlights appeared. Too fast, too close. I remember slamming the brakes, her scream, the explosion of glass, metal folding, time tearing apart. Then silence. When I woke up, the car was sideways. The air smelled like smoke and rain. I couldn't feel my legs at first, only the pounding in my head. Then I heard her voice, soft, panicked, fragile. Ethan? Ethan? Ethan, I heard her voice. Soft, panicked, fragile. Ethan, I can't see anything. I thought she meant the dark. I told her it was okay, that help was coming. But even then, something inside me knew it wasn't the dark outside that she meant. The ambulance lights painted the night red and blue, and I held her hand until they pulled us apart. She kept whispering, "It's just the dark, right? It's just the dark." And I couldn't answer. 3 days later, I woke in a hospital room with my arm in a cast and guilt in my chest. They said I was lucky. But the word felt cruel when the person I loved lost her world because of me. When I finally saw her, she was sitting by a window, her face turned toward the light she couldn't see. Her eyes were open, but they were far away. When she heard me enter, she smiled faintly. "Ethan," she whispered, "it's gone. The light. It's all gone." And in that moment I realized I wasn't the one who survived. I was just the one left to remember how everything used to shine. The first weeks after the accident felt like living underwater. Everything sounded distant, heavy, wrong. The hospital became our second home. White walls, beeping machines, the constant smell of disinfectant. She moved through it like a ghost learning how to exist again. I stayed by her side, describing everything she couldn't see anymore. The tulips by her bed were yellow like morning light. The sky was gray like forgiveness. The nurse's hair was red like summer. She said she wanted to remember colors through my words. So I talked, every day, every hour, even when she didn't answer. When she was finally discharged, we moved into my apartment. I taped the corners of the tables, learned the shape of every object through her hands. She mapped the rooms by memory, calling the couch the harbor and the bedroom the shore. We built a small life around the idea of survival. I cooked for her, I read to her, I became her eyes, but I also became her guilt. Some nights she would sit in silence and say, "You shouldn't have to do this." And I would answer, "I don't have to. I want to." Therapy became our new rhythm. She learned how to walk with a cane, how to count her steps, how to measure trust in footsteps. Every lesson came with frustration, every success with tears. The doctors said her optic nerves were damaged beyond repair, but Lila never let the words "beyond repair" touch her lips. She said, "If I can still dream of light, maybe it means it's still somewhere in me." And I held on to that like scripture. The guilt ate at me in ways I couldn't describe. I replayed that night every time I closed my eyes. The rain, the headlights, the sound of her voice when the world went black. I would have traded anything to give her back what I took, but she never blamed me. Not once. That was what hurt the most. Months passed, seasons changed, and slowly life began to settle into a strange, fragile peace. We laughed sometimes. She made fun of how I burned toast. I told her she looked beautiful even when she couldn't tell. But then came the day the doctor mentioned a word that made my heart race. Trial. An experimental surgery, nerve stimulation, something new, risky, painful, but maybe possible. When I told Lila, she didn't speak. She just held my hand and whispered, "What if I get to see you again?" And for the first time in months, I let myself cry. The clinic was cold, all metal and hope. Every Thursday we went back. The doctors ran their tests, attached the electrodes, whispered words like progress and response. I waited outside every time, pacing halls that smelled like fear. When she came out after the first session, she looked exhausted but alive. It felt like thunder behind my eyes, she said. That night, she dreamt of colors again. She told me she saw flashes, red, blue, gold, like pieces of memory fighting their way back. I didn't sleep. I watched her breathe and imagined light stitching itself into her skin. Week after week, she fought through pain and doubt. Sometimes she saw nothing, and the silence in her voice scared me more than any scream could. But then, little by little, the impossible began to happen. She started to describe light, not shapes, not faces, but the feeling of brightness. It's like warmth pretending to be color, she said once. I wrote everything down. One morning, the doctor pulled me aside. It's working, she said, slowly. But something's waking up. My hands shook as I told Mila. She smiled through tears and whispered, then promise me something. When I see again, I want the first thing to be you. Weeks later, it happened. The doctor asked her to open her eyes near the window. Morning light filled the room. She blinked once, twice, and gasped. I see something, she whispered. Her pupils trembled. There's light. There's movement. Ethan, is that you? I stood frozen. Yes, I said, my voice breaking. She smiled, tears streaming down her face. You're blurry, she whispered, but I'd know you anywhere. And in that instant, the world turned gold again. When she opened her eyes again the next morning, the world was still a blur, a watercolor painting that hadn't dried yet. But it was there. Light, movement, shadows, colors she could almost name. I stood by her bedside, afraid to speak, afraid to breathe too loudly, as if a single sound could break the fragile bridge between blindness and vision. Her gaze wandered slowly, trembling like a child learning to walk. Then her lips parted. The curtain. It's blue, isn't it? I froze. The doctor nodded from behind me, but I couldn't. I was still trapped in disbelief. Yes, I whispered. It's blue. And then, for the first time in almost a year, she laughed. A real laugh, full and trembling, like a storm turning into sunlight. They kept her under observation for days, adjusting the dosage, testing her reflexes, watching her pupils dance to the rhythm of hope. Each day the fog lifted a little more. Colors returned first, then outlines, then faces. One afternoon, she stared at her reflection in the mirror for a long time, then said softly, I thought I'd forgotten what I looked like. I walked behind her and smiled. You haven't changed. She shook her head, eyes wet. I've changed everywhere except here, she said, pressing her hand over her heart. When they finally released her from the clinic, the world outside looked brand new, as if it had been waiting for her to come back. She stood in the doorway for a long time, blinking at the sunlight, overwhelmed. I watched her take her first steps into the open air, the breeze tugging at her hair, her eyes tracing every line, every motion. It's so much, she whispered. Too much and not enough. I smiled. You'll get used to too much. Life didn't return to normal. It created a new version of itself. She wanted to see everything again, to rebuild every memory she had been forced to imagine. We spent days walking through parks, markets, train stations. She stared at everything as if it were a miracle, because it was. She cried at sunsets, gasped at rainbows, laughed at her own reflection in shop windows. One evening she said, You told me colors were stories. Now I finally understand. At home she moved differently. Freer, braver. The cane leaned forgotten by the wall. Sometimes I caught her looking at me quietly, as if comparing the man she remembered to the one she now saw. You're thinner, she teased. You worried too much. I laughed. You made it worth it. But the truth was, I had forgotten how to be seen. For months I had been her vision. Now she had her own again. It took time to learn how to exist beside that freedom without feeling unnecessary. One night, while we cooked dinner together, she reached for my hand and said, "You know what I missed most?" I shook my head. "The way your eyes look when you say my name." She paused, then smiled through tears. Now I can see them again. I didn't have words, only her hand in mine, warm and real. The doctor said full recovery might never come, that her sight could fade again someday. But she didn't care. "I lived in darkness long enough to know how to love the light," she said. I believed her. The world had become our classroom again, and every day was a lesson in gratitude. Months later, we returned to the road where it all began. The rain had just stopped, and the air smelled like forgiveness. She stood by the guardrail, looking at the curve that had changed everything. "It doesn't scare me anymore," she said. "It just reminds me that even the worst nights can lead to mornings like this." We drove back in silence, her head resting on my shoulder the same way it used to. The sun fell over the highway, gold and endless. She turned to me and whispered, "You were the last thing I saw before the dark came. And the first thing I saw when it ended." Maybe that's what love really is. Not what stays the same, but what survives the fall. And as the light washed over us, I finally believed that some stories don't have to end in tragedy. Sometimes, they just need time to find their way back to color. A year passed like a quiet miracle. Seasons moved without hurry, and every morning I woke beside her still half afraid it had all been a dream. Lila's sight was never perfect, but it was enough. Enough to recognize faces, to see colors, to watch the sky change its moods. She said it was like living in a painting that never stopped moving. Some days were sharper than others, some more blurred, but she called them all blessings. "Even when it's hazy," she said, "it's still mine." We moved back to the coast that spring, the place where we first met, where the sea had witnessed both our breaking and our beginning. The same shoreline, the same salt in the air, but this time the world was softer. She wanted to paint again. At first her strokes were hesitant, almost afraid. But soon the canvas began to breathe colors blending like second chances. Sometimes she'd laugh and say, "I'm painting the light I used to imagine." Watching her paint was like watching sunlight remember itself. One evening, after a long walk by the water, she stopped suddenly. The wind was warm, carrying the scent of rain. "Do you know what today is?" she asked. I smiled. "It's Thursday." She shook her head. "It's the anniversary of the accident." I froze, unsure if I should say sorry or stay silent. But she reached for my hand and said, "Don't look like that. I'm not remembering the crash. I'm remembering what came after." What we became. We stood there as the tide touched our feet, gentle and forgiving. The sunset spilled across the water, a slow fire burning into gold. She leaned against me and whispered, "You once promised that the first thing I'd see again would be you." I nodded. "And you kept your promise," she said. "But now I want the next thing I see to be forever." I turned to her, heart stumbling. "What do you mean?" She smiled. "Marry me, Ethan." For a moment I forgot how to breathe. Then I laughed, a shaky, disbelieving laugh, and said, "You can't steal my line." But she already had. A month later, we stood barefoot on that same beach, surrounded by friends, waves, and the smell of salt and memory. The ceremony was small, almost quiet enough for ghosts to attend. She wore a white dress that caught the wind like it wanted to fly away, and when she looked at me, really looked, it was as if the whole world had waited for her eyes to open just for this. When the vows came, she spoke first. "I once lived in darkness," she said softly, "and I thought that meant the end of everything beautiful. But then you stayed. You became my sight when I had none, my faith when I lost mine, and my peace when I couldn't find it. You showed me that love doesn't need eyes, it just needs presence. And when I opened mine again, you were still there. So this isn't a beginning, Ethan. It's a continuation of every moment you refused to leave." I tried to answer, but my voice caught somewhere between laughter and tears. "You taught me what strength looks like," I said. "You taught me patience, forgiveness, and what it means to see someone completely, even when they can't see you back. You made me believe in light again, Lila. You are my light. The guest disappeared behind the blur of tears. And for the first time in a long time, neither of us looked away. We kissed, the sea roared its approval, and the sky burned itself into the kind of orange you can feel in your chest. Later that night, after the music faded and the stars arrived like witnesses, we sat by the fire on the beach, the same place where everything had once ended. She leaned on my shoulder, quiet, content. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked. I nodded. "Every day." She smiled faintly. "Me too. But not the crash, the part after. The sound of your voice. The way you said my name like it was the only thing keeping me here." She lifted her gaze toward the sky, eyes shining with reflected firelight. "I used to dream of light," she whispered. "Now I live inside it." The wind moved through her hair, gentle and endless. I looked at her, at the woman who had fallen into darkness and climbed back toward the sun. And I thought, maybe love isn't about seeing someone perfectly. Maybe it's about seeing them anyway. The waves rolled closer, wrapping the shore in silver. Behind us, our footprints stretched together into the night. She reached for my hand and said, "Promise me one thing." I smiled. "Anything." She squeezed gently. "If the dark ever comes again, remind me how beautiful it was to see." I kissed her forehead and whispered, "I will." Every time. And as the tide whispered against the sand and the stars scattered their light across the ocean, I realized the truth. Some love stories aren't meant to teach us how to survive the dark. They exist to show us how to recognize the light when it finally returns.